I thought hiring a dog trainer would help our family, until I discovered he was training more than just our dog. What I uncovered next changed everything. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 6 years. We had a pretty great life together, nice house, decent jobs, and recently, we got ourselves a dog. Max was a handful, though, so we decided to hire a trainer to help out with his behavior. That's how Caleb, the dog trainer, came into our lives. He was professional, great with animals, and seemed like the perfect fit for our high-energy pup. Since I worked full-time and Emily worked from home, she handled Max's training sessions with Caleb. He'd come over twice a week, around 4 p.m., which worked perfectly for her schedule. I'd wanted to have the sessions later, closer to when I could be home, but Caleb's schedule was already packed, so we went with the afternoon slot. I didn't think much of it at the time. At first, everything seemed fine. Emily would casually mention how the sessions were going, telling me about the techniques Caleb was using and how well Max was responding. I was glad we'd found someone who seemed to know what he was doing. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things that felt off. For one, Emily started talking about Caleb more than I expected. It wasn't just about Max's training, either. She'd mention his sense of humor, or how dedicated he was to his clients. I brushed it off at first, thinking she was just impressed with his work. But after a while, it felt like I was hearing about Caleb more than I was hearing about Max's training. Then there were the days she dressed up for the sessions. Emily usually worked in casual clothes since she was home alone, but on training days, she'd put on makeup, style her hair, and change into something nicer. When I asked her why, she just laughed it off, saying it was a way to keep things fresh and feel good while working from home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I wanted to believe her, but a tiny voice in the back of my mind told me there was more going on than just a dog training session. As the weeks went on, my unease only grew stronger. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was overreacting. Emily was my wife, and Caleb was just the dog trainer. But each time I brushed it off, something new would happen that pulled me back into that creeping suspicion. One day, I came home a little earlier than usual. Max was in his crate, resting, and the house was strangely quiet. I assumed Emily was working in her office, but as I walked through the house, I noticed the back door was open. Curious, I stepped outside and saw Emily standing on the patio, deep in conversation with Caleb. They didn't see me right away, so I stayed hidden, watching. Their body language was close. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand casually resting on his arm, lingering a bit longer than I was comfortable with. Caleb leaned in slightly, his posture relaxed, and for the first time, I noticed an ease between them that seemed more than just friendly. When Emily finally spotted me, her reaction was almost too quick. She jumped back slightly, pulling her hand away, and gave me an overly bright smile. "Oh. Hey, honey. You're home early," she said, her voice cheerful but with a strange edge to it. Caleb quickly straightened, giving me a polite nod. I forced a smile and played along, but inside, the doubts were starting to boil over. As Caleb left, Emily brushed off the whole interaction, saying they were just talking about Max's progress and how Caleb thought he'd be ready for more advanced training soon. But that night, as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The lingering touch, the way they'd laughed together, it all seemed too familiar, too comfortable. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, but deep down, I knew that I had to keep a closer eye on what was happening during these training sessions. After that day on the patio, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Emily's enthusiasm for Max's training sessions seemed to reach new heights, almost like she looked forward to them more than anything else. She'd start getting ready for Caleb's arrival hours in advance, fixing her hair, putting on perfume, even choosing clothes that I'd usually only see her wear when we went out. One afternoon, I decided to casually ask her about the sessions. I tried to sound light-hearted, as if I were genuinely interested in Max's progress. "So, how's Max doing with Caleb?" I asked over dinner, watching her reaction. She glanced up, a little too quickly, and smiled. "Oh, he's making a lot of progress," she said, sounding cheerful. "Caleb says he's a natural." "What kind of stuff does Caleb have him doing?" I pressed, trying to get more details. She hesitated, as if trying to remember something specific. "You know, basic obedience, leash training, stuff like that." Her tone was vague, almost dismissive. But the way she quickly changed the subject only added to my doubts. The next day, I had an idea. Since I couldn't be home during the sessions, I decided to set up a camera in the living room where most of the training took place. It felt invasive, and I hated the thought of spying, but I needed to put my mind at ease. I'd been tying myself in knots with worry, and if there was nothing to find, then I'd finally have some peace. I hid the camera carefully, making sure it was aimed at the living room where Caleb and Emily usually worked with Max. The thought of catching them doing something they shouldn't made my stomach churn, but I needed to know the truth. That evening, after the session, I reviewed the footage. For the first few minutes, it was just as I expected, Emily and Caleb working with Max, running through basic commands. But then, halfway through, things took a turn. Caleb sat down on the couch, and Emily joined him, their conversation drifting away from the training. They laughed, their heads leaning closer together. Her hand brushed his knee, and he didn't move away. It was subtle, but enough to leave me reeling. I stopped the video, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen anything concrete, but their body language spoke volumes. I knew I had to keep digging. Seeing Emily and Caleb that close on the couch sent my mind racing. The way they looked at each other, how comfortable they seemed, it was something I couldn't unsee. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, wondering if I was reading too much into it or if my instincts were right. But a part of me knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. So, I decided to keep the camera rolling during the next few sessions. I hated the idea of spying on my own wife, but I needed to be sure. Every day after their training session, I'd quietly watch the footage, hoping to catch a real sign of what was going on. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed a pattern. Their training seemed to be more about spending time together than focusing on Max. There were too many long conversations, too much laughter, too many lingering glances. I saw Emily leaning in closer than she'd ever done with any friend, and Caleb seemed all too happy to reciprocate. Each day, it was as if they forgot Max entirely. Then one Thursday afternoon, I came across something undeniable. In that day's footage, the session had started out normally enough. But halfway through, Max wandered off, leaving just Emily and Caleb on the couch. Emily reached out, resting her hand on Caleb's arm. He leaned in, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering on her shoulder. My stomach twisted as I watched her lean toward him, closing the distance. And then, they kissed. I sat there, stunned, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. The betrayal felt raw, piercing, like a physical blow. All the little signs, the suspicions I'd tried to ignore, they were all right there, in front of me. My wife was cheating on me with the man who was supposed to be training our dog. I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to let it all sink in, to think about what I'd seen and what I'd do next. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers. But another part of me needed to stay calm, to figure out my next steps carefully. For the first time, I knew I was living with a stranger, a woman who could look me in the eyes, lie without a hint of guilt, and carry on as if nothing had happened. And as painful as it was, I also knew that the time for denial was over. The next day, my mind was a mess of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. I could barely focus at work, replaying the footage over and over in my head, my stomach twisting each time I pictured Emily and Caleb together. By the time I got home that evening, I knew I couldn't keep it in any longer. I needed answers. I waited until after dinner, when she was in the living room, looking at her phone like everything was perfectly normal. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than usual. She looked up, surprised. "Sure. What's on your mind?" I took a breath, watching her closely. "How have the training sessions with Caleb been going?" Her eyes flickered, but she quickly put on a casual smile. "Oh, they've been great. Max is really responding to the training. Caleb's been such a big help." I nodded, holding her gaze. "Is that all Caleb's been helping with?" She froze, her face barely masking a flash of panic. "What do you mean?" she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice had a slight tremor. I pulled out my phone, opening the video and setting it on the table between us. Her eyes widened as she saw the screen, the exact moment she and Caleb kissed playing right there in front of us. She looked away quickly, her face turning pale, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle for words. "Ben. I can explain," she finally whispered. "Explain?" I said, my voice shaking. "What is there to explain, Emily? I trusted you. We got Max together, we hired a trainer together, and you used that time to betray me." She took a shaky breath, reaching out toward me, but I pulled back. "It was a mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't mean anything." "A mistake?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You've been meeting him twice a week, letting him into our home, lying to me every single time. Don't tell me it didn't mean anything." She looked down, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Ben, please. I don't know what happened. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you." I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I looked at her. "You hurt me the moment you decided that a fling with our dog trainer was worth more than our marriage. And now you're going to have to live with that choice." I stood up, leaving her there in stunned silence. I could see the regret and shame on her face, but I couldn't bring myself to feel anything for her anymore. She'd made her decision, and now, I would make mine. After our confrontation, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. Emily's betrayal had ripped through everything I thought we'd built together, leaving behind a void that I couldn't quite process. I went through the motions that night, barely hearing her attempts to apologize, her tearful explanations, and desperate promises that it meant nothing. None of it mattered anymore. She had made her choice, and the time for excuses was over. I slept on the couch that night, unable to be near her. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a quiet determination grew in me. I knew what I needed to do. This wasn't something I could forgive or forget. I deserved honesty, and if she wasn't willing to give me that, then I'd make sure I built a life where I could find peace on my own. The next day, I began looking for a divorce lawyer. I wanted to do this right, clean, straightforward, and final. I wasn't interested in dragging it out or getting into bitter arguments. I simply wanted to walk away from the wreckage she'd created and start rebuilding a life without deception. That afternoon, as I made calls and set up appointments, Emily tried reaching out to me, leaving voicemails and texts, begging for a chance to talk. She swore up and down that she would end things with Caleb, that we could work through this, that every couple has their struggles. But I ignored each message, each call. I was done hearing her excuses. I was done being lied to. By evening, I returned home to find her waiting in the living room, looking exhausted, as if the weight of her choices had finally hit her. She stood up as soon as she saw me, wringing her hands nervously. "Ben, please," she started, her voice soft and pleading. "Can we just sit down and talk about this? I don't want to lose you. We can fix this. I know we can." I shook my head, my voice calm but firm. "No, Emily. There's nothing left to fix. You made a choice to betray me, and there's no going back from that." Her face crumpled, and she looked down, silent for a moment before whispering, I never thought it would end like this." "Neither did I replied, feeling a pang of sadness but also a sense of finality. "But you made it impossible for us to move forward." I walked away, leaving her standing there, realizing that the life we'd shared was over. And while I knew the road ahead would be hard, I also knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself. The next morning, I met with a lawyer to officially start the divorce process. Sitting across from her, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was surreal to realize that the woman I'd shared my life with, the one I'd built a future with, was now someone I wanted to leave behind. But as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. My lawyer listened attentively, gathering the details of Emily's affair with Caleb. When I mentioned the videos I'd recorded, she nodded, explaining that this evidence would be useful, especially since it showed the extent of Emily's betrayal and the emotional distress it had caused. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, knowing that Emily's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. Once I left the lawyer's office, I took some time to clear my head. The days that followed felt like a blur. I went about my work, put energy into my routines, and spent time with Max, who'd always been a source of comfort. It felt strange to look at him, knowing that he was the reason Caleb had entered our lives, and yet, he was innocent in all of this. I decided I'd keep him with me. Max was my dog too, and I wasn't going to let Emily's mistakes take him from me. Meanwhile, Emily kept trying to reach out, hoping to talk things over. I could tell she was panicking, scrambling to salvage what she could, but I kept my distance. I needed the space to move forward, and I was done giving her chances to explain away what she'd done. I'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. Then, one evening, I received a message from Caleb. I hadn't expected him to reach out, and seeing his name on my phone made my blood boil. He'd sent a long, guilt-ridden text, apologizing for his mistake and asking if we could meet to make things right. I stared at the screen, anger welling up inside me. He'd walked into my home, under the pretense of training our dog, all while betraying my trust in the worst way possible. And now he wanted to apologize. I didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would change the damage he'd done. That night, as I sat in my empty home, I realized that I was already starting to feel lighter. The ties to Emily, the weight of her betrayal, they were loosening. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my life. I wasn't sure what the future would look like, but I knew it would be one built on honesty, even if that meant building it alone. As the days went on, the reality of the divorce set in, and with it came a strange sense of clarity. I no longer had to hold on to the hurt, the betrayal, or the lies. Instead, I was focused on making a clean break and moving forward. Emily had tried reaching out less often, perhaps realizing that there was no turning back. And for once, I felt genuinely free. One evening, as I was sorting through some documents in preparation for the final stages of the divorce, Emily showed up at the house. I hadn't expected her, and seeing her standing at the door brought up a mix of emotions I hadn't prepared for. She looked worn down, her face drawn and her eyes heavy with regret. For a moment, I thought she might have changed her mind about the affair, but I kept my distance, letting her speak first. "Ben," she began, her voice trembling, I just wanted to see if there was any way we could still talk. About everything." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Emily, we've already talked. There's nothing left to say. I know what you did. I know you betrayed me, and there's no going back from that." She nodded, her eyes downcast, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse. "I don't know what I was thinking," she admitted softly. "It was a stupid mistake. But I never wanted to lose you." I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. She went on, "I ended things with Caleb. I told him we couldn't see each other anymore. I want to fix this, Ben. I want to make things right." But I shook my head. "Ending things with him doesn't erase what you did. You broke my trust, Emily. And right now, all I want is to move on." She looked at me, tears forming in her eyes. "Is there really no chance for us?" Her question hung in the air, but my answer was clear. "No, Emily. There's no chance. Not after everything." Without another word, she nodded, tears spilling over, and turned to leave. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of finality and relief. This was it, the end of everything we'd built, and the beginning of something new for me. As the door closed behind her, I knew I'd made the right choice. The pain of betrayal was fading, replaced by a sense of freedom and resolve. I wasn't bound by her lies anymore, and I could finally start focusing on a future built on my own terms. For the first time, I felt that I could let go, truly free from the weight of her choices, ready to build a life that was honest, simple, and completely mine. After that final conversation with Emily, something shifted inside me. The sense of loss I'd been carrying around was slowly replaced by a quiet strength. I had spent so long wrapped up in the pain of her betrayal, but with each day that passed, I found myself focusing less on the past and more on what lay ahead. With the divorce paperwork nearly finalized, I poured my energy into creating a life that felt like my own again. I focused on work, reconnected with old friends, and even picked up a few hobbies that I hadn't touched in years. I spent more time with Max, too. He was like my shadow, faithfully by my side through all of this, and he became a huge source of comfort. Taking him for runs, teaching him new tricks, it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. A few weeks after that last conversation with Emily, I was at the dog park with Max when I ran into a woman named Kate. She was there with her own dog, and our paths crossed when our dogs started playing together. At first, it was just friendly conversation, talking about our dogs, their quirks, the usual stuff. But as the days went on and we ran into each other more often, our chat started to get longer, easier, and somehow deeper. Kate was refreshing, a warm presence, easy to talk to, and completely honest. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone like that until I met her. She didn't know about my recent past, and I didn't feel the need to tell her right away. We were just two people enjoying each other's company, and for the first time, I felt a spark of hope that maybe I could find happiness again. As things with Kate grew, I felt myself slowly letting go of the bitterness and hurt I'd been holding on to. Emily and Caleb became little more than a closed chapter, a memory that I could look back on without pain. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. Kate and I took things slow, but each moment with her reminded me of what trust and connection could feel like when they were built on honesty. She knew nothing of the person I'd been before, and it felt like a fresh start in every way. One evening, as we walked together with our dogs, Kate looked at me and said, "I don't know what brought you here, but I'm glad you're here now." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too," I said, meaning every word. For the first time, I was grateful for the path my life had taken, even with all its bumps and heartbreaks, because it had led me to a place where I could start over. This was my new beginning, and I was finally ready to embrace it, leaving the past firmly behind me. As much as I was moving on with my life, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and Caleb had walked away far too easily. They had destroyed my marriage, lied without a hint of remorse, and carried on as though nothing had happened. The idea of them just moving on while I picked up the pieces didn't sit right with me. I wanted them to understand the damage they'd caused, and to feel some of the consequences. I thought long and hard about what would hurt them most. I didn't want to stoop to their level with petty actions, but I wanted to make sure that the ripple effects of their betrayal reached them in a way they couldn't ignore. So, I came up with a plan. First, I gathered all the evidence I'd documented, the footage, the messages, every proof of their affair. I created a folder and made sure that nothing was left out. Then, I sent a carefully crafted message to the dog training company Caleb worked for, attaching the evidence and explaining in detail how he had conducted himself while working in my home. I included how he'd taken advantage of a professional relationship to destroy a marriage, adding just enough emphasis on his lack of professionalism. Caleb's company prided itself on discretion, and I knew that a scandal like this would be the last thing they'd want associated with their brand. Within days, I heard back from a mutual acquaintance that Caleb had been let go from his position. It seemed that the company didn't appreciate having its reputation tangled up in personal drama. Knowing that he'd lost his job gave me a sense of justice, not because of pure revenge, but because he'd abused his role, and now he'd face the consequences. Next, I turned my attention to Emily. She had her own network of friends and family, people who had always looked up to her, admired her. I shared my side of the story with some of these people, letting them know exactly what had happened. I didn't embellish or add unnecessary details, but I let the truth speak for itself. Slowly, word got around, and her carefully curated image started to crumble. Friends began distancing themselves, family members confronted her, and she found herself increasingly isolated. As I watched everything play out, I didn't feel the anger or satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt a strange sense of closure. They were finally facing the fallout from their actions, finally understanding that betrayal has a cost. When I ran into Kate later that week, she noticed the change in me immediately. "You seem lighter," she said with a smile. "I am," I replied, realizing it was true. The need for revenge had burned out, leaving behind a sense of peace. I had done what I needed to do, not out of spite, but to hold them accountable. And now, I was finally free to leave it all behind. With that final chapter closed, I was ready to embrace the future, knowing that I had done everything I could to take back control of my life. To my surprise, the divorce process moved faster than I'd anticipated. With the evidence I'd gathered and the airtight case my lawyer had prepared, Emily didn't have much room to fight. Maybe it was the guilt or the pressure of our friends and family finding out the truth, but she didn't put up any resistance. In fact, she agreed to the terms without a single argument. Our lawyers handled most of the details over email and phone calls, and I didn't even have to go to court. The division of assets went smoothly. I got to keep the house, Max, and the majority of our savings. It was as though Emily just wanted to sign the papers and put it all behind her. Part of me wondered if she was hoping to escape the fallout faster, to start over without the baggage of our marriage weighing her down. But I didn't care about her motivations anymore. All that mattered was that I was free. When the final paperwork arrived, I looked over each page, almost in disbelief. This was it. The marriage we'd built, the years we'd spent together, all officially reduced to a few signatures on paper. But instead of feeling sadness, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. The last ties to that chapter were now severed, and I was finally, completely free. I signed the documents, packed them up, and sent them off without a second thought. When I got the confirmation a few days later that everything was finalized, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't felt in a long time. To mark the occasion, I took Max for a long walk, reflecting on how far I'd come since the day I discovered the betrayal. I wasn't the same person who'd been blindsided by Emily's lies. I'd grown stronger, more resilient, and more certain of what I wanted from life. As we walked, I found myself looking forward, not back. The scars were there, but they no longer hurt. I was free, unburdened by the past, and ready to build a life that was truly my own. From that moment on, I decided to leave the pain and betrayal behind. Emily and Caleb were part of a closed chapter, and now, I had my own future to focus on, one that held promise, peace, and the kind of happiness I'd once thought I'd lost forever. With the divorce behind me, I could finally focus on moving forward. Life was beginning to feel lighter, even, normal again. After everything that had happened, the simple routines I'd taken for granted before now felt like gifts. Max was my constant companion, and in a way, he'd helped me get through the worst of it. So, I decided it was time to get him a new trainer, someone I could trust, someone with a strong reputation and, most importantly, no ties to my past. After doing some research, I found a local trainer named Lisa. She came highly recommended, with a great track record, and her clients swore by her. I met her one afternoon, and right from the start, her professionalism was clear. She was respectful, straightforward, and genuinely invested in helping Max succeed. I felt instantly at ease with her, which was a relief after everything that had gone down with Caleb. The sessions with Lisa were exactly what Max needed. She worked wonders with him, and it was clear he was learning quickly under her guidance. Watching Max's progress became a welcome distraction, something positive I could look forward to. Each training session with Lisa reinforced what I'd learned through this whole ordeal, that I could rebuild my life on my own terms, with people who genuinely respected boundaries and professionalism. Outside of Max's training, life was looking up in other ways too. Work was going well, and I started reconnecting with friends, making time for social events I'd put on hold. I was focusing on self-care, trying new hobbies, and enjoying the freedom of a fresh start. There were moments of sadness, of course, but they came less often, and when they did, they didn't linger like they used to. The anger and hurt were slowly being replaced by a sense of peace, and I could feel myself letting go of the past a little more every day. Friends and family noticed the change, too. People kept telling me how different I seemed, more grounded, happier. And they were right. It was easier to smile, to laugh, to enjoy the little things again. One evening, after Max and I returned from a training session, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset with him by my side. I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely at peace. The pain of betrayal had lost its grip on me, and I was ready, truly ready, to move forward. With each passing day, the past felt further behind me, and I could see a future that was entirely mine. No more lies, no more betrayal. Just the quiet, steady joy of living life on my own terms, with Max by my side and a new beginning ahead. With each day that passed, I felt myself becoming more whole. The weight of the past was slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of calm and contentment that I hadn't felt in years. Max's new trainer, Lisa, continued to be a positive influence. Max was thriving, becoming more obedient and relaxed, and our time together became a daily reminder of how far we'd come. One weekend, I took Max on a hike, something I'd wanted to do for ages but had kept putting off. As we reached the top, looking out over the sprawling landscape, I felt something click. I'd spent so much time rebuilding myself, focusing on healing, that I was finally starting to feel the benefits. The doubts, anger, and sadness were no longer defining me, they were simply part of a story I was ready to leave behind. A few days later, Lisa and I wrapped up a training session, and she asked if I wanted to join her for coffee. There was something so genuine about her offer that I couldn't say no. We ended up talking for hours, about everything from dogs and careers to travel and family. She was easy to talk to, with an energy that felt sincere and refreshing. From that day on, Lisa and I started spending more time together, slowly getting to know each other outside of Max's training sessions. It wasn't forced or rushed, it was natural, like discovering a friend who truly understood me. There was no pressure, no need to be anything other than myself, and that alone felt like a gift. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that this friendship with Lisa was quietly blossoming into something more. It felt different from anything I'd experienced before, no secrets, no lingering doubts, just a connection built on mutual respect and trust. And the best part? It was happening at a pace that allowed me to savor each moment without rushing. By the time fall came around, I was officially divorced, living on my own terms, and, to my surprise, ready to embrace a new relationship. Lisa and I spent more time together, exploring the city, going on long hikes with Max, and building memories that weren't tied to the pain of the past. She knew about everything I'd been through, but it didn't define us. We were focused on the present, on the simple happiness of a fresh start. Looking back, I realized how much I'd grown. The betrayal I'd endured had once felt like the end of my world, but now it was simply a chapter, a hard lesson that had ultimately led me to a place of peace, strength, and new beginnings. For the first time, I felt completely free, unburdened, and genuinely hopeful about the future. With Max by my side, and now, someone who truly valued honesty and trust, I was ready for whatever lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, I could say with confidence that I was truly happy. As I settled into my new life with Max and began spending more time with Lisa, I started hearing rumors about Emily. People would occasionally reach out, filling me in on what had become of her, even though I hadn't asked. It turned out that her life had taken a downward spiral since the divorce. The relationship with Caleb hadn't lasted. After all, what had started in secrecy rarely survives in the light of day. Without me to come home to or our marriage to lean on, Emily seemed to lose her sense of direction. According to some mutual friends, she had started drinking heavily. At first, it was just the occasional night out, but over time, it became a constant pattern. Friends who'd once cared about her had urged her to get help, suggesting she seek treatment or talk to someone, but she brushed them off. She'd become distant, closed off, even from the people who once stood by her. It was strange hearing these things about her. A part of me felt pity, while another part of me knew that this was the natural outcome of her choices. She'd sabotaged her own marriage, hurt the people around her, and now, it seemed, she was hurting herself. There was nothing I could do for her. She'd made her bed, and now she was lying in it. But as much as the rumors could have stirred up old anger or bitterness, I found that they didn't. They were just echoes of a chapter that was already closed. Emily's struggles were hers alone, and I'd moved so far beyond that part of my life that they felt like a distant memory. Lisa knew about my past, and we'd occasionally talk about the strange turns life had taken. She'd listen without judgment, offering insights that helped me see just how far I'd come. I'd learned to let go of resentment, to replace anger with acceptance, and to focus on the good things life had brought me. Watching Emily's self-destruction only confirmed that I'd made the right choice, that my life was better without the lies and the betrayal. One evening, as Lisa and I took Max for a walk, I looked over at her, feeling a sense of gratitude I hadn't expected. I'd come through so much, but somehow, I was standing here, with someone who valued honesty and peace just as much as I did. The past was behind me, Emily, Caleb, and all the pain they'd caused. I didn't need to dwell on their choices or the way they'd each fallen apart. I had a new life to look forward to, filled with trust, companionship, and real happiness. For the first time, I truly felt free. I had built a new chapter, with people who respected and cared for me, and I knew that, no matter what came next, I'd be okay. The end of one story had simply been the beginning of a better one.